Every time someone mentions an invasion in Europe, we all know which ones they're talking about. The 1941 German invasion of the Soviet Union is probably the first thing that springs to mind. And while it's definitely one of the most brutal, it isn't the only time. After all, that's how both world wars started. Someone invaded someone else, and that led to decades of misery for everyone involved. But did you know that there was also a time when America invaded Russia? Not during the Cold War, not after the fall of the Soviet Union, but during the actual war itself? It's true. And the fact that no one talks about this today is kind of weird because it is actually pretty interesting. But before we get into it, we need to establish one thing. When we talk about America, we're referring to the United States of America, or at least some part of them, since the United States didn't exist yet. We'll refer to them as the United States or the U.S. Anyways, the story takes us back to 1918. At this point, the Russian Revolution has already happened, and the country is now known as the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, or the USSR. The White Army, consisting of anti-Bolshevik forces, was still trying to fight against the Bolsheviks, who were known as the Red Army. But things weren't going well. The Reds had taken over most of the major cities and were advancing into the outskirts of what is now St. Petersburg. Things were bad enough for the Whites that a British military mission was sent to Russia to discuss the possibility of intervention with General Jan Christian Smuts. This was around the same time that American President Woodrow Wilson announced his intentions to enter World War I on the side of the Allies. This is important because while the U.S. was initially hesitant to commit ground troops to Europe, Wilson was open to sending forces to Russia. It's not like he would have wanted a full-scale U.S. invasion of Russia. That never really seemed likely. But he wasn't opposed to a smaller force getting involved. He had even mentioned this to the public in 1917 when he said, "If the things I have been saying are not true, and if our boys are being sent into Russia merely on a wild goose chase, then I am for once mistaken, and you may pin your faith on the declaration of the President of the United States." However, things got complicated when Wilson's top military advisor, General Tasker Bliss, made it clear he was opposed to sending troops to Russia. So Wilson had to walk so that General Bliss could come back from his vacation. And this made the timing of any potential intervention difficult, because now they had to wait until Bliss returned. So the British proposed a plan where they would begin the intervention themselves, with Canadian and British forces landing in northern Russia and pushing south along the Volga River. This would hopefully relieve pressure off of the struggling White Army and allow them to continue fighting. Meanwhile, American forces would land further south in Arkhangelsk and make their way up north. Now, this didn't seem like a great idea to many people. The journey through northern Russia was incredibly dangerous, and no one expected that the weather conditions would be completely horrible during the winter. But despite these concerns, plans were made and everything was set in motion. On March 1918, 2 Canadian infantry battalions landed in the Russian port of Arkhangelsk, followed by another battalion a few days later. Their orders were to push south along the Volga River towards Ekaterinburg and relieve White Army forces trapped in the city. Meanwhile, the Americans landed further south at the port of Vera. In total, the Allies committed around 3,500 troops to the effort, with the British providing the majority of the force. When the Canadians arrived, they found the situation in Russia to be much worse than they had expected. As soon as they left their ships, they encountered soldiers from the Czechoslovak Legion, who were former Austro-Hungarian prisoners of war that defected and ended up fighting for the Soviets. The Legionnaires told the Canadians that the only way to get to Ekaterinburg would be to go through hostile territory. With limited supplies and almost no knowledge of the area, the Canadians realized they were in trouble. They needed to get out of here as fast as possible. But when they went to contact their ships for transport back to safer territory, they found that the ships had left without them. See, when the Canadians arrived, they were told to hold their positions until further notice. This meant that the men had to stay put, even though the situation was hopeless. They were now stranded behind enemy lines with very little food and no real way of getting back to Allied-controlled areas. Thankfully, the Red Army didn't consider the Canadian force to be a threat, and instead of attacking them, they basically just ignored them. The Canadians spent the next 2 months slowly making their way south, surviving off of the land and avoiding the Red Army. When they finally reached Ekaterinburg, they found that it had already fallen to the Reds. This was a disaster. Everything was going wrong. The situation for the Americans was equally terrible. When they arrived in Vera, They were supposed to head north to join the rest of the Allied forces. But they quickly found that the Siberian government was opposed to the intervention and actively tried to stop the Americans from moving north. Luckily, the U.S. had a strong military presence in Vera, so they were able to hold the city against the Soviets. But this meant that instead of joining the Canadians, they were stuck defending a port city that nobody really wanted. In total, the U.S. sent around 6,500 troops to Vladivostok, and they, too, were forced to survive off of the land and avoid any encounters with the Red Army. Eventually, the U.S. forces managed to advance north and meet up with the beleaguered Canadians, and they all headed back to their ships together. But why? Why would the US and Canada do such a pointless invasion? Well, it has a lot to do with what was happening in Russia at the time. You see, the Bolsheviks were not only fighting a civil war against the various white armies, but they were also fighting against foreign powers that were trying to invade Russia themselves. These included troops from Britain, France, Japan, the US, and several others. The Russians called this the intervention in the Russian Civil War, and it played a significant role in the country's history. The main goal of the intervention was to prevent Russia from leaving World War I. The problem was that the Bolsheviks were looking to end Russia's involvement in the war, and they were willing to do whatever it took. This led to the Soviets focusing their efforts on driving out the foreign powers rather than winning the war. And it became clear to the Allies that if they wanted to keep Russia in the war, they would have to commit more troops to the effort. However, the Allies were hesitant to do this because of domestic opposition to the war. By this point, World War I had been going on for 4 years, and people were exhausted. Many of them felt that the war wasn't worth fighting anymore, especially if it meant committing more men to a conflict that seemed endless. This is why the British government was so hesitant to send troops to Russia in the first place. They knew that it would be a risky move, and they weren't sure if it was worth it. But ultimately, they decided to go for it because they felt that they had no other choice. The situation in Russia was becoming increasingly desperate, and they needed to do something to help. And this is why the U.S. and Canada sent troops to Russia, not because they wanted to, but because they felt they had to. Unfortunately, the intervention was ultimately a failure. The Allies were unable to prevent Russia from leaving the war, and the country descended into chaos. The intervention also had a negative impact on the relationship between the Allies and the Soviet Union. It created a climate of distrust that would last for decades. Today, the intervention is largely forgotten, but it's important to remember because it's a reminder of the dangers of foreign intervention. The Allies went into Russia with good intentions, but they ended up making things worse. Anyways, that's it for me. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.